Hello everyone and welcome to the Knowledge Pool, your source for everything regarding the rules of Magic the Gathering. Today we'll be going over one of the most obnoxious mechanics that Wizards includes at least one card of every set, which is phasing. Let's begin. First of all, let's begin with the rules breakdown. Phased in and phased out are actually a status of the card, so all cards are inherently phased in and they are only phased out if they have phasing and are called phased out, or they are phased out with a certain effect. Now, on to how phasing works. Phasing is a static ability that modifies how the untap step works, one of the steps that is notorious for being the least malleable steps in Magic the Gathering. So, during each player's untap step, before that player actually untaps or does anything else, all phased in permanents that have phasing phase out, and at the same time all phased out permanents that had phased out under that player's control phase in. Keep that in mind. And also a fun fact here, the day-night change happens after everything phases in. That's because you need to have your werewolves and stuff on the right side in the right time, and that's why they have ruled it that way. Now, what happens to a permanent when it phases out? First of all, its status changes to phase out, as we already covered, and except for rules that actually care about phased out permanents, they are treated as though they don't exist, and they usually can't be affected by anything else in the game, at least as of yet. And also, if a creature happens to phase out during combat, let's say with the first protection, it obviously is removed for combat. And when inadvertently something phases in, its status changes again to phased in, and the game treated though as it exists. One of the most common misconceptions about phasing is that it causes zone change triggers to occur. That's not true. Phasing is actually one of the few things in Magic the Gathering that don't cause a permanent to change zone or control, even though it's treated as it does not exist and not under its controller's control while it's phased out. Which means that zone change triggers don't trigger when a permanent phases in or out. That's pretty much the way Wizard has to make sure a permanent is unaffected by everything. Also, a way to either imprison commanders without being able to be accessed by their controller for a small amount of time, or to make sure you don't have a way to abuse enter and leaves the battlefield effects. One change that happened in phasing was actually with the first protection, which is one of the most notorious cards with this mechanic, is that tokens used to be extinct when you phase them out. But after the card was released, the rules changed so the tokens do continue to exist on the battlefield while they phase out. So if they phase out, they will return. Another really important thing is that any counters the permanent had on it remain on the permanent while it's phased out. So it does not phase back in and get the counters back, it actually has them continuously. And the effects that would check if a permanent left the battlefield or not don't count the phasing event as actually causing the permanent to leave the battlefield or enter the battlefield. Now let's look at some more unique rules about phasing, starting with what happens to anything that was attached or equipped to a permanent. So if a permanent phases out, any auras, equipments or fortifications that were attached to the permanent phase out at the same time. This is what is known as indirect phasing or phasing out indirectly. And what will happen is that when that permanent phases back in on the next untap, it will phase in with the equipment or aura or fortification it had attached to it. Now the question comes here is, what will happen if we play the first protection which phases out everything essentially? Well, the rules cover that too, saying that if an object would simultaneously phase out directly and indirectly, it phases out indirectly, and that's pretty much to cover the possibility of you being able to put the aura somewhere else or phasing it in a weird way. And that's how a creature phased out with an equipment would work. So if you phase out a creature and it had a sword, for example, on it, the sword will phase out as well, and you would be able to equip the sword to any other creature because it's now phased out. Also, one very interesting thing to note here is that if an aura, an equipment, or a fortification phased out directly because of a card, it will phase in attached to the object or plate it was attached to when it phased out. But it will only do that if that object is the same object in the zone or the player that it was attached permanence to is still in the game. If not, the aura, because it will try to attach something but has no target to do so, will go to the graveyard, and if it's an equipment or fortification, the BCB ends the play unattached due to state-based actions, which is really interesting if you try to do something tricky with your phasing spells. And finally, because they actually come in attached as we covered, that means that when they phase in or out, they don't trigger abilities that trigger when something becomes unattached or attached. So we need to also mention what phasing actually stops. Phasing stops continuous effects that have a duration which is stated in the text for as long as. Any effect that say for as long as, for example, Will Breaker, will actually end when a permanent with that effect phases out, because the game can no longer see it as the duration. So for example, Will Breaker, let's say we have stolen 2 of our opponent creature and we play a March of Swirling Mist, the effect of the Will Breaker will end once it phases out. And so if we don't also phase out the other creatures, they will go immediately to our opponent's side. Here the phasing works kind of like exactly like a flicker would work, like a Ghosted Flicker for example, and it's pretty interesting because it's one of the few things that its phasing doesn't cover. And on that note, here is a funny interaction. Let's say we have again our Will Breaker and we have taken control of 2 of our opponent's creatures with its ability. We need to cast a Phase Protection for some reason and everything phases out. Now, what would happen during our next untap step? Well, everything phases back in. Because, as we described in the beginning of the video, phasing states exactly that all phased out permanents that had to phase out under the player's control, which they phased out, phase back in. So since we control those creatures, they phase back in during our untap step. But we already covered that for as long effects like Will Breakers and when they phase out. So that means that because the control changing ended when Will Breaker phased out, but the permanents could be returned to the owner's field because they were phased out, they will phase back in under our opponent's control, their owner's control in that. And so they will still have summoning sickness, because in order for a creature not to have summoning sickness, its controller needs to control it since the beginning of his turn. And that's a really fun interaction that you need to know about Will Breaker. Now, a question many people have, which is another unique thing about phasing, is how we counter it. So one brutal thing you can actually do to phasing, or the Phase Protection in particular, is play things that stop the untap step. Because phasing happens during the untap step, that means that if that phase is somehow skipped, like for a Stasis with example, the phased out permanents will remain stranded there until that player gets an untap step again. So if you want to counter phasing, a good thing is Stasis, but you didn't hear that from me. Finally, let's cover the timing of when phases out or in triggers happen. So let's say I have Simmering Efreet phased out. So it's my untap, it phases back in. When does the trigger happen? Well, because nothing can happen in regards to triggers on the untap step, the only thing that happens is that turn-based actions like the phasing in and out of permanents, the day and night cycle changing, and the tapping of permanents. the next time the trigger will be placed on the stack they are placed. So in the case of Simmering Efreet, the timing of when the triggers go to the stack is during our upkeep, which is the next step in the beginning phase. Now, what would happen if we had said another trigger that triggers on our upkeep is that because the Simmering Efreet triggers waits from the step to be placed on the stack, it has the same timing as at the beginning of upkeep trigger, so we would be able to put them on the stack in whatever order we want. And that was everything covering the basis of phasing in Magic the Gathering. I decided to make this video because phasing will be in our sets from now until Wizards decides that it's not health anymore and it stops printing cards with phasing or that direct with phasing, but it looks like it would still at least include one card per set, and especially commander focused cards. If you watched this whole video, you know I didn't talk about the Fairies Protection and all of its utility as much because I plan to do a separate video specifically on the Fairies Protection, because the card is quite misplayed in commander groups and it's usually thought as more powerful than it actually is. So until the next time, stay tuned to see the Fairies Protection video and other videos I have prepared. Thank you all very much for watching. Have a nice day.